Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it.
Today we are starting off with probably one of the more popular stories of Jesus' ministry, which most likely was not even written about when the book of John was written. Today we're looking at John chapter 8, and actually if you stick around for the reading, which you always should, or you should pick up a Bible and read it for yourself, there's actually a note in the text in the ESV. I'm not sure about all the other versions, but it actually says the earliest manuscripts do not include John chapter 7, verse 53 through John chapter 8, verse 11, and that is the story of the woman caught in adultery.
So the story is actually really interesting. I've heard it many times, but what it is a moment for Jesus to basically be put in a really uncomfortable and uncertain situation. Like coming up with an answer to what is asked of him is like, oh man, what would I say? And then the rest of this chapter really is just a lot of Jesus kind of claiming who he is amongst different people, but a lot of the times it is to the Pharisees and within like Jewish culture, I would say. Like specifically, this is like ministry to the Jews, talking about who he is and the authority that he has over what a lot of them believe to be like even more important than what he is.
All right, so let's dig into this story about this woman caught in adultery. There's a lot of interesting pieces to the actual story, but first I want to explain a little bit about what's going on here with the text. Basically, when the Bible was mass published, I guess we could start there. There was very few manuscripts, very few like original documents, all that kind of stuff in circulation. We're confident of what they had, but we have discovered more since they had what they had. So if you're using if you're a King James person that loves King James, that was made and published and distributed in 1611. So since 1611, we have discovered much more. Particularly, one of the biggest finds is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I think was discovered in around the Dead Sea region in like the 1950s. And it's actually like one of the more intact, oldest manuscripts that we have. There's a lot of information in those. And as we find more remnants and pieces of like literally old pieces of paper with stuff written on them or pieces of like stone and clay and all that stuff that they scribe things into. As we find more of those, we have a clearer picture of what the original text was. And so when we find these really old versions of the Bible, and it goes from John chapter 7, verse 52 into John chapter 8, verse 12, first of all, they probably don't have the chapters and verses, but when it skips that section, it gets our attention. So this is not some huge conspiracy. This is actually an attempt to help people read the Bible clearer and to be more faithful to what we believe is the original text. Like we don't want to be guilty of adding or taking away. So when we find more and more and more evidence that something was not actually there, we want to call out the fact that it was not actually there. Now, to add to it, Jesus in this story doesn't really do anything outside of his character. He doesn't do anything outside of what he would normally do. He doesn't teach anything outside of what he would normally teach. This seems very, very like Jesus, and it seems like something he would do. And it's in circulation enough later on that it seems like probably what happened is somebody wanted to make sure that we captured this story, and after John had written the story and distributed the story, somebody decided to add a piece to it. So it is very likely something that happened, but it's also extremely likely that it was not originally included by John.
So like I said at the beginning, this is meant to be a test for Jesus when the Pharisees bring this woman who was caught in adultery to him. And basically they're saying like, hey, our law says that we're supposed to get rid of her. We're supposed to stone her. What do you think we should do? And I think anybody in that situation would be like, oh man, like uphold life, uphold the law. Like, what do we do in this situation?
Yeah.
I think how he answers them is so interesting. I think there's been so many different takes on what he's writing when Jesus stoops down, when he's writing in the dirt. Anyway, all these things. And basically he responds to them and says, well, I guess whichever one of you hasn't sinned, you can be the one to throw the stones at her. Like, go for it. And how do you respond to that? Like, I mean, that's basically like when you've got a child tattling for yelling at someone. And then it's like, well, were you yelling too? Well, yeah. So it's like, it would seem so foolish for these Pharisees to, one, even argue with it, and to, two, even consider throwing a stone. So the way that Jesus handles this situation is super tactful. And it seems so simple, but I don't think anybody had that response in their minds.
The details of the story, if you start to dig deep into what's going on here, if you look at verse 3, the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery and placed her in the midst. Notice this is only the woman, first of all. So the text says she was caught in the very act. That takes two people. Only one is present. Mm-hmm. So obviously the man has been, freed. Some people suggest that the man is actually still present, but he's actually part of the accusing party. What's interesting is the man's totally gone. It's only this woman. It's crazy to me that these people are using this woman as a tool just to get to Jesus. It's we want to kill Jesus. We'll kill you if we have to in between.
I also think they're very condescending with him too.
Oh, yeah.
Because they come up and it says in verse 4, they said to him, teacher. And I don't know, when I hear that, I just assume
yes.
You're one to be learned from.
Yes.
Tell us what we should do. And Jesus knows their hearts clearly and responds in such a way that they can't argue, and actually makes them look like the student who is very foolish to ask such a silly thing.
It's a very similar way that the rich young ruler treats Jesus. He comes in front of him and uses kind of this soaring language to describe Jesus. And Jesus is I don't have much time for that. Mm-hmm. Then there's a lot of ideas about what people wrote in the dirt. You already alluded to that. Some people say maybe his sin, the sins of the people, he's writing them in the dirt. Maybe he's actually writing Bible verses in the dirt. We don't know, so it's not worth speculating a whole lot. But what is obvious is that Jesus is just refusing to give attention to this issue. Mm-hmm. And his response, this is really interesting, does not remove the guilt from the woman. He doesn't say, okay, everybody leave. I'm letting her off the hook. It's okay, whoever does not have sin, go for it.
Well, and he asks her, he's well, where'd everybody go?
Yeah.
And she's well, they all left. And he doesn't say to her, okay, cool, you're free to go. He says, neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. So it's that same thing again where Jesus is okay, here's the starting point for you. Stop sinning and live a different life that glorifies God.
I think it's so important to highlight, and we've done it a bunch. Maybe you're sick of hearing us say it, but Jesus was not hanging out with people just to hang out with people. He was hanging out with people to warn them about the destruction that their sinful life would bring. And constantly he's telling people, leave your life of sin. So he spares this woman's life. Do remember when he says, let he who is out without sin throw the first stone. Jesus has not sinned. He very rightfully could have demanded this woman's life on the spot. Jesus is a righteous judge. Jesus will be a righteous judge of everyone at some point. He could have demanded her life. He chose not to because God is gracious and merciful and long-suffering. But he tells her, you better stop. And she goes on her way. Now, again, was this a true story? Was this not a true story? We're not sure. It's very likely that this is something that occurred. And we can see that Jesus is, again, gracious and merciful and telling people to leave their life of sin.
And after this, he starts to move into this whole section of pretty much the rest of the chapter where he is being very blatant with who he is. He begins talking with the people about being the light to the world. He also talks about basically mirroring himself to the Father, which obviously states who he is as this man in God form. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it is not going over super well. It is not setting well with certain people who are hearing it. Other people who are hearing it are actually coming around oh, wow, this guy actually is who he says he is. But it's interesting to me where all of this was actually happening, where he was speaking these things. So verse 20 says, these words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. So I think it's really cool. I was talking about this at the beginning, how Jesus is essentially doing that ministry to the Jewish people. He is telling them who he is. He's telling them his significance. He will eventually allude to the fact that he is more important than the things that they have learned throughout history, the stories that have been passed down. He is more powerful even than those individuals. And like I said, it is not sitting well with a lot of the Pharisees. However, it is catching the attention of his target audience, which is the Jewish people.
That's one of the things that's sticking out to me a lot as we read through John. I'm just consistently reminded of the people that actually do believe in Jesus. I'm used to this kind of black and white picture where like Jesus preached and everybody rejected him. That's not true. If you look at verse 30, it says, as he was saying these things, many believed in him. And these are harder things that he's teaching. And then if you look at verse 31, so Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That's still true for us today. Like when we follow Jesus, we believe what he says. The truth will set us free. The truth has set us free. And they're sort of confused because the core identity for this entire group is sort of their like genealogical connection, their, what would you say, like their cultural heritage connection to Abraham. Like they think that they have a special relationship with God because Abraham is essentially their great-great-great-great-grandfather.
Well, in verse 33, that's what they say. When Jesus says, if you abide in my word, and then you will truly be my disciples, they said, well, we're offspring of Abraham. We've never been enslaved to anybody. How is it that you say you will become free as if they weren't before?
It's so interesting to me because you could look at this and you could be like, oh, those people, they're so silly. Like they think that because their relatives were related to Abraham that God would save them, but we still do this stuff today. Like I cannot tell you how many times when I would ask like a student, because I was a youth pastor, when I would ask a student like, hey, like, do you have a Christian background or what? And he's like, well, my parents take me to church or my grandma goes to church. It's like, well, that doesn't mean anything. Like you are individually accountable to God. God will judge you individually, and you have to decide what your relationship with Jesus is going to be. So it's not a new thing that people kind of think about their cultural heritage, their background, and think that that will justify them before God. Like if you believe something like that, you are not correct.
Well, Jesus takes everybody back. He's just like, okay, pause for just a moment.
Yeah.
Let's all get back to the same page here. And he says to them in verse 34, and this is specifically speaking to the Jews. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone, okay, like keyword being everyone, who practices sin is a slave to sin. So it's like, no matter what, you've all sinned. You all give the offerings for the sins you commit. Every single one of you is a slave to that sin, regardless if Abraham is your father or not, or your great-great-great-grandfather or not. You are a slave to your sin.
And the command is follow me and therefore stop sinning. Like
So
leave your life of sin, be set free by me, which is problematic for people today who seem to teach that like, well, just accept Jesus and like, you know, like
you'll just brush those other
you
sins
can
under
figure
the
it
rug.
out. You can figure it out as you go. You don't have to get it right away, which like, okay, God is gracious, God is merciful, but don't you ever take advantage of God's grace. Paul will say later on, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. Like we should never take advantage of God's grace. We should accept the truth of Christ and follow him and leave our life of sin so that we're no longer prisoners to sin. So there's quite a conversation about Abraham and identity in Abraham and like when Abraham was and when Jesus is. The huge thing that Jesus is going to say in this chapter is verse 58. Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So they picked up stones and threw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. This is a huge deal that Jesus says before Abraham was, I am. One, because he's saying he existed before Abraham. Abraham was, thousands of years removed at this point. But two, because he says simply, I am. The same thing that God said to Moses in the wilderness through the burning bush. This is the identity that God has. Jesus is claiming explicitly to be God. And we can see based on the words he's using, and we can see also based on the audience, the way they react. It says they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. They are trying to kill him for blasphemy because he has clearly claimed to be God at this point.
Well, and again, it doesn't go over well. This is like a people that you have been, that has been, I suppose, like learning these stories and like things that they hold so dear, and someone who's saying like, well, yeah, that's fine and all, but like, I'm even greater than that. And I can see where the tension would come from, but it's also encouraging to know that some people who were hearing him, it was making sense. Like the ones, and I think there's a couple of times Jesus refers to in here, like if you actually knew God and you knew the God of Abraham, like you would know and love who I am.
Right.
And that is the case for some people who are hearing him, but there are so many that are so stuck to this like legalistic, cultural, well, we've got the lineage, so we're fine
I'm
situation.
close enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess your part to be pulled from this, what do you think we could pull out of this? Because there's certainly a lot that Jesus is dealing with. So how does that apply to us?
I think it's pretty clear. Actually, both stories, like we talked a little bit about the adulterous woman. We talked a little bit about his interaction here in the temple. Both stories are like, you've got to actually follow Jesus. You have to believe in him. You have to leave your life of sin, and you have to follow what he taught. Both stories, both audiences would have heard that message. That message remains true today. Like Jesus did explicitly claim to be God. He tells us that we need to follow him with our lives, with our decisions. We need to base our lives on what he has taught. And we need to live like we are followers of Jesus. So it might seem pretty simple to you, but that's actually your part for today. Like Jesus said he was God. He said we should follow him. And to follow him, we have to leave our lives of sin and live lives built on him. So we encourage you to do that. We'll be back again tomorrow with John chapter 9. We'll see you then.
Thanks for joining today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. As always, please consider partnering with us as we are a listener-supported podcast that we hope to continue to grow with support from listeners just like you.
We've made it super easy to partner with us, and you can support us by following the link in our show notes or our description. You can support us with as little as $3 a month.
Every little bit of this helps so much, and we're so thankful for your support. With that in mind, here's today's reading.
John chapter 8. The earliest manuscripts do not include chapter 7, verse 53 to chapter 8, verse 11. They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery and placed her in the midst. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." Again Jesus spoke to them, saying, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." So the Pharisees said to him, "You are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true." Jesus answered, "Even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I am going. But you do not know where I come from or where I am going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true. For it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. In your law it is written that the testimony of two people is true. I am the one who bears witness about myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness about me." They said to him, therefore, "Where is your Father?" Jesus answered, "You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also." These words he spoke in the treasury, as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him, because his hour had not yet come. So he said to them again, "I am going away, and you will seek me, and you will die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come." So the Jews said, "Will he kill himself, since he says, 'Where I am going, you cannot come'?" He said to them, "You are from below. I am from above. You are of this world. I am not of this world. I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins." So they said to him, "Who are you?" Jesus said to them, "Just what I have been telling you from the beginning. I have much to say about you and much to judge, but he who sent me is true, and I declare to the world what I have heard from him." They did not understand that he had been speaking to them about the Father. So Jesus said to them, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me. And he who sent me is with me. He has not let me alone, for I always do things that are pleasing to him." As he was saying these things, many believed in him. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered him, "We are the offspring of Abraham, and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free?" Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are the offspring of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me because my words find no place in you. I speak of what I have seen with my father, and do what I have heard from your father." They answered him, "Abraham is our father." Jesus said to them, "If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me. A man has told you the truth, that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are doing the works your father did." They said to him, "We were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, even God." Jesus said to them, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I came from God, and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is of God hears the word of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God." The Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" Jesus answered, "I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets died? Who do you make yourself out to be?" Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I did not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out to the temple. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email, and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.